All right. So we'll get started. Today we're going to start off and cover the origins of Hanukkah, and then after that we're going to put our running shoes on and start sprinting again because we got to get back to some Bible. So it'll be a lot of stuff real quick today after we hit the Hanukkah stuff, but it'll be really good. I've had a blast studying this intertestamental time, especially the post Maccabean revolt times are just nuts. There's the amount of backstabbing and all kinds of stuff. It's very much like Game of Thrones-ish kind of really dramatic stuff. So it'll be fun today. I just want to show you, this is sort of what the world situation is as we dive back in right here, right about when Hanukkah, when the rededication of the temple occurred. If you remember, before, the Seleucid Empire, at its height, about 50 years before this, included this whole region here. And then they also had they held sway over all this too. So you can see there's already cracks forming in the Seleucid Empire. Things are shrinking. When we started this process after Alexander, Rome is just this little itty bitty area here. And now you can see they've already defeated Carthage in the First Punic War and the Second Punic Wars, which gave them control of all of Spain and all of Sicily. So things are starting to expand with Rome, and they're going to start factoring into the equation more and more and more here. And like I mentioned this last week, like Jane said, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening off the right edge of the screen in Asia that we just ignore because there's a giant set of mountains in between, and never the twain shall meet until you meet a guy named Marco Polo. Now that's not true. There were people who traveled back and forth, but there's a whole huge, the Silk Road still existed in part back then, but for the most part, stuff on east of, the fact that India is involved in here, I didn't even know that India was involved in any of this stuff until, I was in my 30s when I started studying history for fun, or my 20s and 30s. So, there's a whole bunch of stuff east of the screen, right of the screen here that we are not even going to worry about because it doesn't really factor in to any of the Christian story. So, all right. So, that's not where I wanted to be, but that's okay. Same man. All right. So, let's begin. Hey, Mandy. I got the stand. Yes, there'll be no time. I showed some of them time lapse. They enjoyed it. I'll show you that later today when we're done. But let's begin. I'll pray Psalm 125 in Jesus' name. Those who trust in Jesus are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved but abides forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forevermore. For the scepter of wickedness shall not rest on the land allotted to the righteous, lest the righteous stretch out their hands to do wrong. Do good, O Jesus, to those who are good, and to those who are upright in their hearts. But those who turn aside to their crooked ways, Jesus will lead away with evildoers. Peace be upon Israel. All right. Let's get started. Hey, Olivia. All right. So, when we last left off, Judah Maccabees was making a name for himself. He had started an army because the Greeks were persecuting the Jews. They made Judaism essentially illegal because Antiochus Epiphanes wanted his whole nation to be Greek in every way, shape, and form. So Judah Maccabees starts a revolt, wins a lot of battles because the Syrians aren't really all that unified, and Antiochus says, all right, well, I got to deal with this. So let me start here. This is First Maccabees. So I'm going to read some chunks today, and then after I get through some of the relevant chunks and we start getting into this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, like I said, we're going to put on our running shoes and we're going to sprint through this because there's a lot of details, and if you want to figure it out, there's some great YouTube videos out there that will detail the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean dynasty. But for our purposes, once we get through the Hanukkah stuff, I'm ready to move on to detailing Pharisees, Sadducees, Romans, Herod, and then we'll get into the Gospel of John. So, slow for a little while longer, then we're going to sprint, and then we'll be hopefully to Gospel John soon. So, when King Antiochus heard these reports, he was greatly angered, and he sent and gathered all the forces of his kingdom, a very strong army. He opened his coffers and gave a year's pay to his forces, and ordered them to be ready for any need. Then he saw that the money in the treasury was exhausted, and that the revenues from the country were small because of the dissension and disaster that he had caused in the land by abolishing the laws that had existed from the earliest days. He feared that he might not have such funds as he had before for his expenses, and for the gifts that he used to give more lavishly than preceding kings. He was greatly perplexed in mind. Then he determined to go to Persia, collect the revenues from those regions, and raise a large fund. So, Antiochus Epiphanes realizes, oh, I got problems in my back door, because remember, Antiochus's capital is right here in Antioch. Okay? And he's got a whole bunch of problems down here. Okay, so he realizes, I need to fix this. So what does he do? He tries to buy people off. He tries to buy a huge army, but he realizes, I've done this like 5 times now, I have no money left, so I need to go get some more money. So what he decides to do is he's going to go off into Persia, up here near Ecbatana, and then down here in the Persian homelands and in Babylon to try and raid their treasuries, because he needs to pay people. And you'll note here, here he says, he feared that he might not have as much funds as he had before, and for the gifts that he used to give more lavishly than preceding kings. So there's a whole lot of bribery going on here. A lot of these ancient kingdoms functioned more like the Godfather than they did like William Wallace, right? When you think of this stuff, think rich people, rich families with their own personal armies, and if you want to get stuff done, you've got to pay people off. So Antiochus is running out of money. He's already raided the Jewish temple, I think twice. So he's got to start paying people off, so he heads off to Persia. So he leaves, but he leaves a guy in place. This guy named Lysias. Now, the important thing here, Antiochus never makes it back again. And we'll see why. So we're going to start dealing with the successors, the Greek successors to Antiochus Epiphanes, and we'll see what happens to Antiochus. So, he left Lysias, a distinguished man of royal lineage, in charge of the king's affairs from the river Euphrates to the borders of Egypt. So basically he says to this guy, you're in charge now, I'm going to go do a bunch of stump speeches and raise some money. Okay? Lysias was also to take care of his son Antiochus, so this is the heir apparent, until he returned. And he turned over to Lysias half of the forces and the elephants and gave him orders about all that he wanted done. As for the residents of Judea and Jerusalem, Lysias was to send a force against them and wipe out and destroy the strength of Israel and the remnant of Jerusalem. He was to banish the memory of them from the place, settle aliens in all their territory, and distribute their land by lot. Then the king took the remaining half of his forces and left Antioch, his capital, in the 147th year. He crossed the Euphrates and went through the upper provinces. So, they're going to settle aliens in their territory and distribute their land by lot. So they're going to do the Assyrian thing. They're going to try and wipe them out. Okay? He's so tired of these Jews, he wants them gone, erased from history, never to be seen again. And he leaves this guy in charge to do it. Yeah. So, what happens next? I wanted to detail a little bit of what happens. There's a whole mess of battles. The short version is the Syrian forces under Lysias come down one at a time. We talked about this a little last time. They all want to get there first so they can have their name in lights and say, oh, I didn't know who did this. Because Judah has like 10 or 20,000 people, and Lysias has over 60,000 and thousands of cavalry and a bunch of elephants too. But they never mass their forces and go down. So what Judah does, think Vietnam, he lures them into dark corners and fights battles where they're not expected. Okay? Eventually, first there's Apollonius comes down. So there's a guy that comes down here from Samaria down into Judah. He beats him one-on-one there. Then the Sarin guy comes down here at Beth Horon. He gets beat there. And then, do they have Gorgias in here? No, they don't. Down here at Emmaus, and yes, that's the Emmaus that you're familiar with. There's a big battle fought here. And what Judah Maccabees does is he realizes the Syrian forces are going to try to attack him at night. So when they leave to attack him at night, Judah goes around their backs and attacks them at night, destroys their camp. Those soldiers see their camp burning, they get sandwiched between the two, and then everybody runs away scared. So there's a lot of guerrilla warfare here. So when you're an invading army and the locals don't like you and you don't know the terrain, it's really difficult. Okay. For example, see, every war in history, right? Ask Napoleon and Hitler and Hannibal and all these people, right? There's just a whole tons of examples, right? Stalin, right. There's just thousands of these examples where people will invade places they don't know, and because they don't have the local support, they just die a slow death. So, eventually, after this battle at Emmaus, Judah Maccabees goes back to Jerusalem, and I forgot to put the map up, but hold on. Sorry for the swooshing. I know, although my wife's not here, so that won't make her too upset. So Judah Maccabees comes to Jerusalem at the time that we're talking about. This is from the time of Jesus. This wall here doesn't exist yet. Okay, but when he comes, Judah, after a long siege, is able to clear out all of this area and the Temple Mount. But remember, there's still a bunch of soldiers here. They had fortified the city of David, the old David. They called it now the Acra, which is just a word for fortress. There's a huge mess of soldiers in here under or behind big walls, and it's going to be decades before they actually get them out. So while the rededication of the temple happens, just several hundred yards away, there's a giant bunch of soldiers. So they've got a bunch of soldiers. There's a bunch of Jewish soldiers, around this, making sure they don't really need to be on this side because there's a big hill over here. But they've got a bunch of Jewish soldiers, standing here, keeping them penned in there. And this is going to be a problem for a long time. But they've got them penned in there, which means they now have access to the temple. So remember, sorry. Okay, so the cleansing and dedication of the temple. So remember, Antiochus had taken all the gold stuff out. He burned up all the scrolls, all the ones that were left. He sprinkled pig broth on them. He had built a pagan altar on top of the altar outside the Holy of Holies and sacrificed a pig on it. Okay? So the temple, basically, there's all this stuff happening, and there were a bunch of battles there, so there's dead people around here. Now, if all that's happened, you can't use the temple for sacrifices. You have to fix that first. You can't just go in and start using it again, right? Okay? If there was a huge massacre in our sanctuary, we'd probably have a special service where we prayed to God for, forgive us for whatever part we played and help us to bless this area, stuff like that. They had more rules than that, than we did, though. So, and actually, where's the part about? All right, here we go. So I'm just going to read a huge chunk from 1 Maccabees. Then Judas and his brothers said, "See, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." So all the army assembled and went up to Mount Zion. There they saw the sanctuary desolate, the altar profaned, and the gates burned. In the courts they saw bushes sprung up as in a thicket, or as on one of the mountains. They saw also the chambers of the priests in ruins. Then they tore their clothes and mourned with great lamentation. They sprinkled themselves with ashes and fell face down on the ground. And when the signal was given with the trumpets, they cried out to heaven. So, they walk in there. It's not just the temple, it's even the rooms where the priests live. Everything's torn up and destroyed. Then Judas detailed men to fight against those in the citadel, that's the fortress I just talked about, until he had cleansed the sanctuary. He chose blameless priests devoted to the law, and they cleansed the sanctuary and removed the defiled stones to an unclean place. They deliberated what to do about the altar of burnt offering which had been profaned. And they thought it best to tear it down so that it would not be a lasting shame to them that the Gentiles had defiled it. So they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until a prophet should come to tell what to do with them. Then they took unhewn stones as the law directs, and built a new altar like the former one. They also rebuilt the sanctuary and the interior of the temple and consecrated the courts. They made new holy vessels and brought the lampstand, the altar of incense, and the table into the temple. Then they offered incense on the altar and lit the lamps on the lampstand, and these gave light in the temple. They placed the bread on the table and hung up the curtains. Thus they finished all the work they had undertaken. So, they don't just clean the place out, they scrape the walls off. And by scrape, I mean they replaced all the bricks, right? This isn't just tuck pointing. This is resurfacing the inside of the temple, because this had been defiled by so much pagan religion. They wanted to make sure this place was clean. Paul?
Any idea how they funded this?
Just off the backs of, the local people. It's not, all the labor's free, right? This is your people. This is Judah with a sword saying, hey, we're going to do this now. So the new gold would just be from, although I will say this, remember there were lots of Jews who sided with the Greeks, and they got rich off that. And now Judas is in charge. So that money was now accessible to Judas, right? So he probably took a lot of money from those who had been collaborators with the Greeks. So there's part of that too. So there's still, it's not like there's no...
Strong arm.
Yeah, so remember, mob army. Even the good guys, kind of a mob army, right? So you're gonna pay us protection money, and it would be a shame if something happened to your stall. That kind of thing. But also just blatant, like, you collaborated with the Greeks, so we're gonna take your money now because you stole it from us by unfair business practices.
All's forgiven then at that point?
No. There's going to be grief all the way up through until the temple gets destroyed, between the Hellenizers and those who didn't collaborate. So, one important thing here, we had talked about this when we introduced the Apocrypha a couple weeks ago. They said they tore down the altar and stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until a prophet should come to tell what to do with them. So what do the people in that day believe about prophets?
They spoke the word.
They ceased.
Oh.
There's none left, right? So they're saying we don't have anyone to turn to tell us what to do with these stones.
Okay, I read that differently.
Yeah.
Okay.
And when they do come, they'll have the power to do it.
Once one shows up,
Yeah.
he'll tell us how to rebuild the temple in 3 days, right? No prophet arises in Israel until John the Baptist shows up, and they didn't listen to him, right? So even at the time of the Maccabees, they said prophets have ceased to speak. The person writing this doesn't think he's a prophet, right? And the people who write the scriptures that we base our doctrine on, prophets and apostles, right? This guy's saying in the book, I am neither one of those things, right? So don't base your doctrine off of this, because he's saying, I'm not a prophet, the guy who's writing this, right?
I heard Jan say that, I read that different, and I think I might have too, like, the prophet wasn't there in Jerusalem, so they had to wait till the prophet came around. And then when he was there, he'd tell them what to do with the stones. But you're saying, until we have a prophet again, because
Yeah.
we don't have any prophets these days.
Yes.
And one shows up.
It's generally understood by them that since Malachi, there have been no prophets.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's no, prophecy has ceased to speak. Okay, the Old Testament prophecy canon is closed. There's no more words straight from God. So from then on, they're operating based on everything that has been written down, much like we are today, right? So in many ways, God spoke to his people of old by the prophets. Okay, now he's spoken to us by his son. So those are the two things you should listen to: the prophets and his son, and we would say the people his son specifically sent to tell us what to do, the apostles.
In a way, then, that statement is almost a prophecy, right? It's like...
Well, prophecy and predicting the future is not the same thing.
Right.
Right, so prophecy is a larger term that basically means speaking the words of God with the authority of God. But yes.
But it's speaking with the faith that a prophet will come.
Yes.
I feel like.
Belief and prophecy are different things, because I'm not a prophet. I speak a lot of things in faith, right? But I'm not a prophet,
Yeah.
right? That's a different. So, So they decide, we're gonna resurface the inside, put up new sheetrock. By sheetrock, I mean giant stone, right? Right. Early in the morning on the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Chislev in the 148th year, they rose and offered sacrifice as the law directs on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built. At the very season and on the very day that the Gentiles had profaned it, it was dedicated with songs and harps and lutes and cymbals. All the people fell on their faces and worshipped and blessed heaven, who had prospered them. So they celebrated the dedication of the altar for 8 days and joyfully offered burnt offerings. They offered a sacrifice of well-being and a thanksgiving offering. They decorated the front of the temple with golden crowns and small shields. They restored the gates and the chambers for the priests and fitted them with doors. There was very great joy among the people, and the disgrace brought by the Gentiles was removed. Then Judas and his brothers and all the assembly of Israel determined that every year at that season, the days of dedication of the altar should be observed with joy and gladness for 8 days, beginning with the 25th day of the month of Chislev. At that time, they fortified Mount Zion with high walls and strong towers all around, to keep the Gentiles from coming and trampling them down as they had done before. Judas stationed a garrison there to guard it. He also fortified Beth Zur to guard it, so that the people might have a stronghold that faced Idumea. So there's the story of Hanukkah. What's missing? The oil thing, right? Okay? The oil lasts for 8 days thing, right? It's not in there, right? That comes from later Talmudic tradition, okay? And the best summary of this is actually the Megillah, I forget what it's called, but there's a name for the scroll it's on. This is the one from the Wikipedia page where they tell you the story of it. After this, so this is a retelling from a later document. After this, the sons of Israel went up to the temple and rebuilt its gates and purified the temple from the dead bodies and from the defilement. And they sought after pure olive oil to light the lamps therewith, but could not find any, except one bowl that was sealed with the signet ring of the high priest from the days of Samuel the prophet, and they knew it was pure. There was in it enough oil to light the lamps therewith for 1 day. But the God of heaven, whose name dwells there, put therein his blessing, and they were able to light from it 8 days. Therefore, the sons of Hashmoni made this covenant and took upon themselves a solemn vow that they and the sons of Israel, all of them, to publish against the sons of Israel, to the end that they might observe these 8 days of joy and honor, as the days of the feasts written in the book of the law, even to light in them so as to make known to those who come after them that their God wrought for them salvation from heaven. In them it is not permitted to mourn, neither to decree a fast on those days, and anyone who has a vow to perform, let him perform it. So,
This is at Christmas time, Hanukkah.
yes. Yeah, this is right.
8 days.
Yep. So, this 8-day thing, right? So the story is they need to light oil for the temple because one of the Old Testament commandments is that every day there's a menorah, a 7-branched candle stand that you light with oil. They didn't have candles back then. 7-branched lamp that you have to have lit all the time. Now, can you use the oil that everybody else messed with? No. So they find one jug, supposedly from the time of Samuel. So this oil is 1,000 years old at this point. Okay? They light the lamp with it. Why can't they make new oil the second day? What's wrong with all the people?
They're all defiled.
They're also defiled. They just fought a war. If you kill someone and you touch a dead body, you can't, if you touch other things, you make it unclean. And in order to become clean, you have to wait 7 days. So that's why they need 8 days of oil, because they can't make any new oil because they're all dirty, right? So that's where the 8 days comes from. 7 days plus 1 because of, you can't work on the Sabbath day, okay? So that 8th day comes, they press olives, make new oil, and everything's good to go. But the story is that they had the lamp lit for 8 days from one jug of oil because they had to wait because they were all ritually unclean. Okay? Now, did this happen? Did this not happen? I don't know. Does it affect your faith? Not in the slightest. Okay? The Feast of Dedication, definitely a thing. We'll talk about it when we get to the Gospel of John. Jesus goes to Jerusalem for the Feast of Dedication. But doesn't mention the 8 nights. Okay? It's not a thing in there. All right? So that's the story, but it comes from another document, and that comes Some people think it wasn't written until hundreds of years later, but who knows? Doesn't really affect much, so I'm not gonna worry about it, okay? A lot of the stuff we're studying in this class these days doesn't really affect much because we have the Gospels, right? Okay, any questions on this, Sheila?
So the Jewish people believe all through until we get to Matthew? Because
Believe what?
They believe this, there wasn't only oil for one day, so God made it for 8 days.
We don't know if the story of the oil, the documents we have are from after the time of Christ.
Oh,
So we don't even know historically when this story came about. People in their day kind of looks like they didn't know anything about this,
oh, wow.
so we don't really know. A lot of historians think things are myths. I don't want to lean on that because a lot of historians think that, you know, until a little bit ago they thought David didn't exist, and then all of a sudden, what do you know? We find stuff that says David on it, right? So I don't want to lean too much in secular.
I was just thinking, so the Jews do not believe in Jesus, but they must believe in that.
Some did, not everybody. Judaism, one of the things we'll get to as we get here, Judaism, the farther we go from the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, Judaism starts to spread out and become a whole bunch of different things. Okay? So when you hear Jews and you meet somebody on the street that says they're Jewish, that's a huge tent. And there's Jews from Babylon, Alexandria at this time, from off farther into Europe, that all believe various different things. They're not unified, okay? And there's some people that think that like the temple in Jerusalem isn't worth being around anymore, right? Because they're defiled, because they're corrupt. And we'll cover more of that here soon. But the Jews believed is a statement you can't really make because they're different, they're varied, they're not monolithic. But that story about the oil, in the earliest documents we have were written, as far as we can tell, after the time of Jesus. But that doesn't mean they weren't passed down from before the time of Jesus. It just means the farthest back we can track them is like 150 AD. That's as far back as we get. So we don't really know, right?
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I mean, that's what the historical project is, trying to figure out from all this evidence what's real and what's not. And you do all this stuff, and then all of a sudden you slide over into, oh, there's the gospel, and there's thousands of things that all say the exact same thing. And then all of a sudden there's this archaeology that confirms all of it. So like the historical documents of the New Testament, the earliest copies of Homer, you know, the Iliad, the Odyssey, that guy, those don't come, the earliest copies we have from them happen 1,000 years after the fact. We have documents of the Gospels within 100 years of when they were written. So the Gospels are like the gold standard of historic textual criticism. And yet if we held everything up to the criticism people want to use on the Bible, we would throw out all history before 1300. None of that other stuff exists because we can't know for sure. Because the Bible's way more tested than anything that happened. Right? The only reason we know things about Caesar is because he carved things in stone and he paid people to write propaganda about himself. Right? So it's a whole huge ball of wax. But the important thing for us today is the Gospels are the most attested to documents in ancient history. You can believe them. Okay? Any other questions on Hanukkah stuff? No? All right, are your track shoes on? Are you ready to go?
This wasn't fast?
This wasn't fast, no. I'm going to turn to only putting out the section headers in the book First Maccabees, because I'm going to tell you the story, but I don't want to read it out in front of you because it doesn't really matter that much. At this point, we could skip all the way to the Gospel of John, and I would have to give you a little bit of background stuff, but it's really interesting and fun, and there are people in this room that I know love history, including myself, that this will be a good time. And I spent a lot of time doing this, and I don't want to waste that time. So, once again, this book here, I'm almost done with it, so if you want to borrow it when I'm done, that's fine. The historical section at the beginning of this, excellent. So, all right, so they've rededicated the temple. Now what? Okay, well, the people around are not super psyched that the Jews all of a sudden have power, and also the Greeks not really happy that the Jews all of a sudden have an army and they're trying to find independence. So, the first thing, wars with neighboring peoples. When the Gentiles all around, this is in chapter 5, heard that the altar had been rebuilt and the sanctuary dedicated, they all of a sudden took up arms. So, the Maccabees start fighting in the surrounding area with the Gentiles around them. All of a sudden, they go up here. There's a bunch of Jews that live up in Galilee, up here. And Judah Maccabees, they're getting oppressed by the locals because they're in a very Greek area. So Judah Maccabees' army goes up there, rescues them, and then takes them back down to Judah to resettle them down there. Then Judas and Jonathan, one of his brothers, go off into Gilead, which is this area over here. And they conquer a bunch of stuff over there and grab a bunch of faithful Jews and bring them back. And then, inspired by all this, they go down, they start conquering down here, they have a big win in Hebron, and then they start even heading over into the Philistine territories. Okay? So, chapter 6. The last days of Antiochus Epiphanes. So, King Antiochus, remember, is off doing a fundraising mission. Okay, he's doing his stewardship board duties. Okay, not to anybody in the stewardship board, I'm not trying to equate you with Antiochus. But the point is, he needs money, so he's stealing money, and he's also trying to raise money, and he's also fighting battles while he does it, because remember, he left half the army with Lysias. King Antiochus was going through the upper provinces when he heard that Elamias in Persia was a city famed for its wealth in silver and gold. Its temple was very rich, containing golden shields, breastplates, and weapons left there by Alexander, son of Philip, the Macedonian king who first reigned over the Greeks. So he came and tried to take the city and plunder it, but he could not because his plan had become known to the citizens and they withstood him in battle. So he fled and in great disappointment left there to return to Babylon. So he heads out to Persia and tries to do, very much an Indiana Jones. I'm going to get the lost treasure of Alexander, right? And then use that to pay all these soldiers off. But the locals hear about it ahead of time and say, no thanks. And he gets rebuffed, right? The Syrian kingdom is starting to shrink. Then someone came to him in Persia and reported that the armies that had gone into the land of Judah had been routed, that Lysias had gone first with a strong force, but had turned and fled before the Jews, that the Jews had grown strong from the arms, supplies, and abundant spoils that they had taken from the armies they had cut down, that they had torn down the abomination that he had erected on the altar in Jerusalem, that they had surrounded the sanctuary with high walls as before, and also Beth-zur, his town. So he hears, Judah Maccabees is causing a ruckus. Not only are they winning battles, now they have shields and armor and stuff because we left a bunch of weapons behind when we lost. And then they even started to surround his... Easy ball. I know where you're headed. Then down here in Beth-zur, there's a town that was sort of the southern military outpost of the Greeks in Beth-zur, and they're even surrounding that. So he's upset. He calls his friend Philip, one of his friends. Note the capital F. What does the capital F mean? It's a title. It's not just his buddy. Okay? I'm not just calling up Matthew and saying, hey, Matthew, can you pick up my kid from soccer, right? It's not that. This is one of his people who's got a special ring. He's one of his capos in the Italian mob, right? This is a title. And made him ruler over all his kingdom. He gave him his crown and his robe and his signet that he might guide his son Antiochus. Did I miss a part? Oh, I did. I skipped something. Hold on. Oh, I skipped something. So, anyways, hold on. All right. Let me move something real quick here. So, Antiochus is out here. He tries to steal a bunch of money from down here, and then when he receives word that the Jews are making problems, he's actually up here fighting a rebellion. So he finds out, the Jews tore down everything I did, I'm gonna make them pay. So then, reportedly, right around the time that Judah is rededicating the temple, Antiochus Epiphanes hops on a horse and starts riding this way to try and go deal with this thing himself. And reportedly, according to, I think it was Second Maccabees, he gets taken over by stomach pains, and basically his insides come out, and it's an unbelievably painful death, and then he dies. So Antiochus Epiphanes just out raising money, and now he's gone. So he called for his friend Philip, made him ruler. He gave him his crown and his robe and his signet that he might guide his son Antiochus and bring him up to be king. Thus, King Antiochus died there in the 149th year. When Lysias learned the king was dead, he set up Antiochus the king's son to reign. Lysias had brought him up from boyhood. He named him Eupator, which means, I think, like the good-hearted or something, good father, because this is, you is good, and I forget what Pater is. But anyways, so Antiochus is off in the east trying to raise money. He dies. What happens to the Syrian kingdom? Nothing, right? He's been gone for a while now, and Lysias has been running things for a long time. So Lysias is just like, oh, now I'm actually in charge instead of just in name only, because this Antiochus Jr. is only like 9 years old. So he's too young to rule. So I'll wait for Philip to get here, but until then, I'm going to start dealing with the Jews on my own. So, meanwhile, the garrison in the citadel kept hemming Israel in around the sanctuary. So that fortress that they built, there's still people in there, still a problem. They were trying in every way to harm them and strengthen the Gentiles. Judas therefore resolved to destroy them, and he assembled all the people to besiege them. They gathered together and besieged the citadel in the 150th year. And he built siege towers and other engines of war, but some of the garrison escaped from the siege, and some of the ungodly Israelites joined them. Judah Maccabees decides, all right, I'm finally going to deal with this fortress. They start to build siege engines, so they're trying to recapture their own city. Some of them get out, and a bunch of the collaborating Jews leave the city. Then, Judah Maccabees is over here in Jerusalem, okay, trying to recapture it. And then, finally, there's this battle at a place called Beth Zechariah, which is over here. Okay? So what happens is, Lysias marches down, and this time he actually gets the whole army together, stays on the main road, and Judah Maccabees, who's never lost, is like, all right, now is the time. We're actually going to fight a pitched battle. We're going to do this. We're not going to do guerrilla tactics. We're going to line up on the street and fight with our fists. We're going to do the thing. And they lose. Okay? So Judah Maccabees gets his butt kicked. They run back to Jerusalem. This is the first time it's happened. Everybody's like, whoa, this is weird. He's human, right? So they lose there. Then, back at the temple, the Jewish forces climb onto the Temple Mount, hole up there, and Lysias starts to march his army down to destroy the remnant of the Jewish forces, including Judah Maccabees. And then Judah Maccabees wakes up one day, and the army's gone. Okay? So what happened was, the guy, Philip, that had Antiochus Epiphanes' son, showed up back to Antioch to start to take over from Lysias, and Lysias is like, whoa, I got things to do. See you later. And he tells the Jews, all right, Judaism is no longer illegal. You can be Jews. We're still going to leave a bunch of troops everywhere. You're still going to get taxed. You're still our subject kingdom. But finally, for the first time, they get a concession to say, it's all right. You get to be Jews now. We're going to back off. This finally happens, and the Jews win somewhat of a victory, thankfully, because Antiochus Epiphanes died just in time. Right? So Lysias turns back, goes back to Antioch. The Syrian kingdom is just, there's another civil war. There's civil wars all over the place in this kingdom. Okay? All right. So, why did I want to read all this to you? I know I did. Okay. In the 151st year, Demetrius, son of Seleucus, set out from Rome, sailed with a few men to a town by the sea, and there began to reign. So, Lysias is a general, Philip is a general, they've got Antiochus' son. All of a sudden, Antiochus' cousin Demetrius, who had been a Roman prisoner, the Romans are like, ooh, there's problems over in Syria. How can we make this even worse? Let's add another claimant to the throne. So they sort of fake let this guy escape from prison. And Demetrius goes up there and starts an even bigger civil war. Okay? So now you've got people fighting for Syria, and the Jews are just trying to hold up and say, let's just stay out of this, guys. So Demetrius goes and starts to fight against Lysias. Demetrius defeats Lysias and then becomes the king. Let's down here in verse 5. Then there came to him all the renegade and godless men of Israel, so all the collaborators go over to Demetrius' side, and they were led by Alcimus or Alchemist. I'll call him Alchemist. Here, who wanted to be high priest. They brought to the king this accusation against the people. Judas and his brothers have destroyed all your friends and have driven us out of your land. Now then, send a man whom you trust. Let him go and see all the ruin that Judas has brought on us and on the land of the king, and let him punish them and all who help them. So the king chose Bacchides, one of the king's friends, governor of the province beyond the river, and he went. He was a great man in the kingdom and was faithful to the king. He sent him, and with him he sent the ungodly alchemist, whom he made high priest, and he commanded him to take vengeance on the Israelites. So Demetrius wins the civil war and decides, all right, it's time to smack down these Jews. I'm tired of dealing with these guys. Sends them down and includes a collaborator high priest. So this guy Alchemist goes down, and he's very pro-Greek. He's ready to just get rid of Judaism and just do what he needs to do to be part of the in crowd. So they marched away and came with a large force into the land of Judah, and he sent messengers to Judas and his brothers with peaceable but treacherous words. But they paid no attention to these words, for they saw that they had come with a large force. Then a group of scribes appeared in a body before Alchemist and Bacchides to ask for terms. The Hasidians were first among the Israelites to seek peace from them, for they said, a priest of the line of Aaron has come with the army, and he will not harm us. Alchemist spoke peaceful words to them and swore this oath to them, we will not seek to injure you or your friends. So they trusted him, but he seized 60 of them and killed them in one day in accordance with what was written. And then there's a poem about all these bad things that are going to happen. So Alchemist and Bacchides come down to say, you guys need to turn back into your old subjects. So a bunch of scribes and Hasidians appear. So Hasidians, does anybody remember what Hasid means? You hear the word Hasidic come from that? It means the pious ones. Okay? So at this point, the Jews have reclaimed religious freedom. A huge part of their army is made up of these people called Hasidians. It's a political party. And they said, all we ever wanted was religious freedom. We don't care about who's king. So they basically say, we're out. Okay, we're done. We don't want to fight anymore. So if they want to come and rule us, that's fine, but as long as we get to worship at the temple, doesn't matter. Right? This group, the Hasidians, is who the Pharisees likely grew out of. And we'll hear more about that coming forward, but I wanted to read this so you guys see there's starting to be dissension among the ranks. They've got their religious freedom, and a large amount of people just say, that's good enough for us. We don't really care about who's king because we're poor anyway. It doesn't make a difference to us. When Judah Maccabees is king, we're still, eating roots out of the ground. We're not living a high life, so it doesn't really matter that much to us. Then Bacchides withdrew from Jerusalem and encamped at Bethsaida, and he sent and seized many of the men who had deserted to him, and some of the people, and killed them and threw them into a great pit. He placed Alchemist in charge of the country and left with him a force to help him. Then Bacchides went back to the king. So Bacchides takes over, puts the high priest in. The high priest is supposed to be in charge now, so we've got a collaborator high priest again. Alchemist struggled to maintain his high priesthood, and all who were troubling their people joined him. They gained control of the land of Judah and did great damage in Israel. And Judah saw all the wrongs that Alchemist and those with him had done among the Israelites. It was more than the Gentiles had done. So Judas went out into all the surrounding parts of Judea, taking vengeance on those who had deserted and preventing those in the city from going out into the country. When Alchemist saw that Judas and those with him had grown strong and realized that he could not withstand them, he returned to the king and brought malicious charges against them. So Alchemist gets kicked out, essentially. Judas goes in, starts causing a ruckus, and Alchemist leaves to save his life. The king sends Demetrius sends a new general, one of his honored princes. He goes down to Jerusalem. After these events, Nicanor went up to Mount Zion, and Judas beats him. Okay, he kills him. There's not much more to the story than that. So we've got Demetrius sends an army down. That gets beat. Alchemist is gone because he's scared. So then all of a sudden the Jews realize we've got a chance. They reach out. They've heard of this people called the Romans. Right? At this time, Rome is a republic. There's a whole passage in the book of Maccabees where it says, oh, the Romans are really honorable. Nobody wears a crown. Everything they do is virtuous. They rescue all these oppressed people. And the Jews are like, hey, let's be your buddy and you can be our buddy. And the Romans say, oh, we don't really know anything about these people and we can't really reach them and help them, but they don't like Syria, we don't like Syria, so let's be buddies, right? So now all of a sudden, the Jews have an ally. So they're in this weird state where they're still technically a vassal, subject kingdom to the Syrians, but they're also an ally with Rome, and Rome and Syria are at war. So we've got a weird triangle here. So this is not gonna go well, right? There's no way that this is just gonna be the status quo, so we're not done yet. Eventually, the Syrians come down to attack Judas. Judas gets surprised by this, and he loses a battle and gets killed in it. It just happens, right? Okay, so he dies. One of his brothers tries to turn the tide of the battle. He runs up under, he sees this elephant that's got all this gold on it. So his brother Eliezer runs up under the elephant, stabs the elephant in the heart, kills the elephant. But if you're under an elephant and you kill it, what's gonna happen? It's gonna land on you, right? So Eliezer dies too. Right, yeah. So it's in the book. I mean, it's not really all that relevant, but it's in the book. So, yeah. So now we've got Judas is dead, Eliezer's dead, but there are other Maccabean brothers. Okay, eventually we'll get to this guy named Jonathan, but we're about to get to the end of the war, which is a huge stepping stone. So then Bacchides, this is the general, returned to Jerusalem and built strong cities in Judea. So we built a bunch of fortresses all over the place. In the 153rd year, in the second month, Alchemists gave orders to tear down the wall of the inner court of the sanctuary. He took down the work of the prophets, but he only began to tear it down, for at that time Alchemist was stricken and his work was hindered. So Judas dies, Bacchides takes over again, and then the local collaborator, the guy who kind of makes all this stuff work, because he's Jewish, but he still likes the Greeks, all of a sudden, he dies. At just the right time, right? Incredible amount of luck here, okay? His mouth was stopped, he was paralyzed, and he died in great agony. When Bacchides saw that Alchemist was dead, he returned to the king, and the land of Judah had rest for 2 years. So, one of my favorite things about the American Revolutionary War is that the Battle of Appomattox was in 1781, but the war didn't end until 1783 because nobody got around to doing anything, right? Because this is a big country in America.
Appomattox was the American.
Or sorry, not Appomattox, Yorktown, thank you. Yeah, Yorktown, thank you. See, that's why he's here. He gets 10% of my earnings for this class. So Bacchides realizes, oh, my local collaborator's gone. They've got a new leader. So 2 years go by and nothing happens. Then eventually what happens is, there's a revolt. Another pretender to the throne, this guy named Alexander Epiphanes, all of a sudden somebody shows up and says, hey, guess what? I'm Antiochus Epiphanes. Remember that guy? I'm his bastard son. And I come way out of left field, and nobody knows who this guy is. So he's either legit one of those, and Antiochus Epiphanes wasn't exactly a chaste and decent individual, right? But there's a good chance that some of the local people in the kingdoms in Turkey were like, let's just throw another bad guy in here and make their country have even more problems. So eventually, this guy named Alexander Valus gets thrown in there, and Demetrius is like, oh, I can't deal with this anymore. Demetrius. So Demetrius decides, all right, Jews, I'm tired of fighting you. Why don't you join the cause here? I'll give you freedom and money and territory. And then this Alexander Valus guy reaches out and says, hey, I'll give you even more. So now the Jews go from being subject, Alchemist dies, Jonathan rises to being in charge. This is one of Judah Maccabee's brothers. And he starts playing the bad guys off one another. And eventually they get a peace deal. Okay? So now at this point, Jonathan is in charge. He's not high priest yet, but he's got a peace deal. And they're asking him for help in fighting each other. So things are starting to churn for the Jewish kingdom. They're starting to gain more and more power. And then eventually, a really big thing happens here. Jonathan becomes the high priest. Okay? So up until this time, excuse me, up until this time, the high priest had still been someone appointed by the Greeks. And now Alexander Valus agrees, I'm going to make you the high priest. So for the first time, the leadership, the political leadership, and the religious leadership are now one. Okay, does that seem like a good idea? I mean, politically,
Seems like it at the time.
it works, right? But remember, there's a bunch of Jews, the Hasidians and the Pharisees. They don't want this. Why don't they want this? Not just that. It is the separation of church and state, but it's in the Torah. That there's supposed to be a high priest and a king, and they're not supposed to be the same person. So all of a sudden, you've got the ruling class, the rich, this guy named Jonathan, who starts to not only get the power of the state, but now he's the high priest too, which means he's in charge of everything that happens at church. Okay? And he starts to use this to make money. And now all of a sudden, both of these offices become one. And there's a whole bunch of locals in the Jewish faith that don't like this. And this is going to cause problems for the next 100 years. Okay? A big problem for the rest of the Hasmonean dynasty, from Jonathan to Simon's sons, all the way down to Herod, is going to be this question of Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Sadducees really love being rich. They love the Greeks. They're going to do whatever they have to do to be rich. And then the Pharisees are saying, we need to hold to the old-time religion. Okay? And this is not the old-time religion. Okay? So we're starting to see the beginnings of the Pharisaical Sadducean conflict show up here. Eventually, Demetrius II, so Demetrius, son of Demetrius, comes from Crete, and he sends a general down, gets defeated by Jonathan. The Egyptians invade Syria. So this Alexander Valis guy gets defeated by the Egyptians. So Alexander gets his head cut off. King Ptolemy dies 3 days later. So now all of a sudden, the Egyptians take out one of the claimants to the throne in Syria, and then the Egyptian king himself dies. So it's just chaos, right? There's just people dying left and right. The only stable thing in the area right now is Jonathan Maccabee and the fact that the Romans exist. Okay, so things are nuts. All right. Jonathan starts playing people off one another again, and then eventually there's another guy comes in, another Syrian general named Trypho. I think I can actually get all the way down to the independence, so we're just going to skip most of it. There's this intrigue of Trypho, and it's really confusing, but basically another guy tries to take power, captures Jonathan, so the last surviving Maccabee, Simon, takes over, and then we get here. Trypho dealt treacherously with the young king Antiochus. There's another one. This guy's like 3 years old. He killed him and became king in his place, putting on the crown of Asia, and he brought great calamity on the land. But Simon built up the strongholds of Judea and walled them all around, with high towers and great walls and gates and bolts, and stored food in the strongholds. Simon also chose emissaries and sent them to King Demetrius with a request to grant relief to the country, for all that Trypho did was to plunder. King Demetrius sent him a favorable reply at this request, and wrote him a letter as follows. King Demetrius to Simon, the high priest and friend of kings, and to the elders and nations of the Jews, greetings. We have received the gold crown and the palm branch that you sent, and we are ready to make a general peace with you and to write to our officials to grant you release from tribute. All the grants that we have made to you remain valid, and let the strongholds that you have built be in your possession. We pardon any errors and offenses committed to this day, and cancel the crown tax that you owe, and whatever other tax has been collected in Jerusalem shall be collected no longer. And if any of you are qualified to be enrolled in our bodyguard, let them be enrolled, and let there be peace among us. In the 170th year, the yoke of the Gentiles was removed from Israel, and the people began to write in their documents and contracts, in the first year of Simon the great high priest, and commander and leader of the Jews. So we did it, we made it. 142 BC. We made it. The Jews are officially independent. They're independent so far that if you want to be enrolled in the king's bodyguard, you can now even do that. Right? The Syrians didn't just let anybody do that. They only let the good people, the actual humans, do that, right? So now they're allowing these people to join their army. So we've made it. 167, Mattathias kills the guy on the altar that's commanded by King Antiochus, and now 25 years later, the Jews are actually, in effect, an independent kingdom. They don't have to pay taxes to anybody. They're their own people, right? Cool. Everything's just hunky-dory from here? No. There's more civil wars. There's the Syrians show up again. There's these new people called the Parthians that you've not heard about yet. And then all of a sudden there's this guy named Pompey who's a friend of Caesar's, and things still get nuts. And then eventually you'll find this guy named Herod will show up. And then all of a sudden we get Jesus. So, cool. All right, thank you so much. That was fun. It was fast. I think it was fast. But it was fun. Let me close with prayer with Psalm 126. When Jesus restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then they said among the nations, Jesus has done great things for them. Jesus has done great things for us. We are glad. Restore our fortunes, O Jesus, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. Amen. Woo! You take your shoes off now.